Hello, and thank you so much for joining us today on Baha'i Chat. I want to introduce my co-host, Yusha Assad.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, like she said, to Baha'i Chat. This is a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness, oneness, and unity. Baha'i Chat is committed to addressing racism in America, which is considered our most vital and challenging issue, and we know that. Today, we are having a conversation once again about not getting back to normal and what that really means as the world returns from this pandemic, really identifying what it looks like to establish a new thing and not necessarily looking to get back to the old thing. Baha'i Chat is an uplifting moment when we can turn our thoughts to addressing the world's ills through a spiritual lens. Each session is rooted in the Baha'i writings and the fundamental teachings of the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, the oneness of mankind, and it's led by individuals who are putting these principles into action in their daily lives. We also want to remind you that there are no clergy in the Baha'i faith, which is one of the fundamental teachings of independent investigation of truth. So if you aren't already connected with the Baha'i, but you would like to be, you can send an email to info@baha'i.chat, info@baha'i.chat. Simply write guide in the subject line, and we will be sure to connect you with someone.
If you are new to the Baha'i community, please note that this is the newest independent world religion. This religion came in 1863 to unite the world. Baha'is believe that there is only one God, that because there's only one God, there's truly only one religion, because God would not be in competition with himself, and that all humanity is one, and that God sends messengers, manifestations of God throughout time and history to bring humanity forward, both spiritually and socially. The preeminent issue of the day is the oneness of humanity, and we're here to have that conversation. You know, it's impossible to have unity without first having justice. Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, stated back in the late 1800s that the fundamental purpose animating the faith of God is to bring about justice, to bring about the oneness of humanity. And with all of that, we're going to go ahead and get started.
I have the pleasure of introducing to you all Dr. Joy DeGruy, who I was introduced to years before I understood who I was actually meeting. While in college, as a young Black man in America, I didn't grow up reading. I actually grew up believing that I didn't like reading because of a lot of the books that were offered to me weren't books that spoke to me. When I got to college, I was introduced to a wide range of books. And one of those books just happened to be Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And it helped me to understand the context of what my family was dealing with. But of course, at that time, I wasn't necessarily greatly involved in like understanding who authors were and how to really appreciate a book. But that knowledge stuck with me, and I would use that as conversation even in my own family to talk about how we could grow and heal from things that obviously were embedded in our energy from slavery. And so I actually have a deep connection to that just because of how my family was raised. And I want to introduce you all to her. Dr. Joy DeGruy is nationally and internationally renowned researcher and educator. For over 2 decades, she served as an assistant professor at Portland State University and now serves as president and chief executive officer of Joy DeGruy Publications Incorporated. Dr. Joy DeGruy's research focuses on the intersection of racism, trauma, violence, and American chattel slavery. She has over 30 years of practical experience as a mental health professional, and we're thankful that we get to share this time and this portion of history with her.
And I have the distinct honor of introducing Dr. Arta Monjazeb. I've known about Arta throughout the years because of Joy. They are good friends, and I am so honored to know more about him to do this social justice work, because there are few people out there who are championing social justice. So to know about Arta has been a great privilege, and I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's an associate professor of radiation oncology at UC Davis School of Medicine. He is also an internationally recognized cancer researcher with over 50 peer-reviewed publications in the field and serving as an advisor on several committees for the National Cancer Institute, as well as director of immunotherapy, sorry about that, Arta, for the UC Davis Comprehensive Cancer Center. We are honored to have you both and welcome you both. And without further ado, we will hear 10, if Yusha will set the stage for that, and then Arta will come back and introduce us to Let's Not Get Back to Normal.
Some people say that every 10 years, a new consciousness begins, that something new begins for us. And so 10 is the number of consciousness. As we think about how we transcend in the world, we must also be considerate of how we are growing consciously and how that united and connected consciousness is allowing us to break down the barriers that keep us divided. As you listen to this video and as we transition into the conversation led by our guests and our panelists today, be mindful that 10 is not just your turn up time, it's your turn on time. Get conscious.
See, if we're gonna elevate the people the way we need to, we gotta bring up the consciousness. And that's 10. See, every 10, something new begins, you know what I mean? Let's get it. Mission set, don't censor me, this is lyrically artillery for what the mind and the spirit needs. Chicago in the 40s, this is that resurgence. Economics is turning black and coming back with urgent. I told my daughter, don't sit around on your dreams, nah. Life is a moment, it's shorter than what it seems, y'all. She turning 10, her conscience is growing wings, y'all. She making plans of her own, she running things. So please fall back with them small acts. My young bulls hunt for large packs and hard tracks, and with one rule, to stay on 10 with it. To catch a kill, make it skrill, let your friends get it. If it's a meal, cut a deal, keep your wheels spinning. Consciously turn your hustle into real business. Spend your money with them people that's gonna spend with you. Spend your time with a queen that's gonna build with you. Catch kills with you. 10, we making them people conscious again. Wall Street revive the black dollar we spend. Women are giving birth to the black goddess within. White folks admitting there's heaven in black Eve. Hey, 10, we going to black doctors again. Question their education, black colleges we attend. Black lips are famous, collagen in your skin. 10. Look like we know how to win now. We moving on 10 now. Business is popping up. We know where to spend now. See, I got some homeboys, they doing good biz now. I got me a black on watch on my wrist now. I got a clothing line, my stuff looking crisp now. I got some beard oil from a sister that's rich now. Got a black comic book, that be a hit now. See, I ain't like comic books, but I think they legit now. See, if you put black on it, they put a tax on it. If I see black on it, I drop a bag on it. If it look quality, I don't look at the tag on it. I take a snapshot, I post with the gram on it. Let them go ham on it, even throw spam on it. Feel good to have your own stuff, oh man, don't it? I got a dream, I strategize, put a plan on it. Get to your 10, money to make, so put hands on it. Daggum at 10, we making the people conscious again.
Arta, take us away.
Thank you, Yusha, for sharing that with us. That was very uplifting. It was nice to actually have that music to kind of help center me before we get started here. So I really appreciate that. And thank you, obviously, to Baha'i Chat for inviting me to be here today. And it's always humbling to share a stage or a screen with Dr. Joy. I will just kind of jump into it here. And, you know, we're talking about getting back to normal and as more people are getting vaccinated and the numbers of COVID are going down, everyone's talking about getting back to normal. And I have to be honest, that sounds nice, you know, for me. I am, you know, a fairly well-off physician. I live in a wealthy white neighborhood. So for me, getting back to normal means, you know, I get to go eat at fancy restaurants and I get to take vacations and stay in nice resorts and these types of things. And so, you know, in some senses, getting back to normal sounds like a great thing. But at the same time, I think we've had an opportunity during this past year to step back and kind of take a broader view of where we're at. within our own lives as individuals, but also within the history of human society. And so for me, I have, when I take that step back, I have to evaluate, well, what does that normal mean? What is the cost of my normalcy to humanity, right? And I think as a Baha'i, I'm obligated to do that, yet it's something that I don't do nearly enough. So in some ways, despite all the terrible things going on, this kind of forced step back from life to kind of reevaluate has been a blessing. And in some ways, it's been a wake-up call. And there's two statements that are made in the Baha'i writings about how we should live our lives, particularly in regards to justice and in regards to social justice and racial justice, that was addressed to the Baha'is that live here in the United States. And those two statements are that we should live our lives as a living sacrifice and also with daily vigilance. And so this opportunity to take a step back has given me the chance to really evaluate, well, is that what I've been doing? And you know, unequivocally for myself, the answer is no. And that's not to say that I haven't made any efforts, but I don't think that I've lived up to that standard that I should be holding myself to. And it's interesting because when I look at my own life, but I also look at kind of what's happening in society in general, there's a lot of parallels there. And as a biologist, I'll speak to it in kind of biological terms. You know, we used to think that evolution happens kind of slowly and uniformly over time. But it turns out that that's actually not the case. Evolution actually tends to not happen at all or happen very minimally. And then you have these huge spurts of rapid evolution. And it's when the conditions are right, when a change has occurred, when something has happened to allow that evolution to occur, when a new need has arisen. And so I think the same thing is true in human society, that we're really at a precipice in some senses where we have an opportunity to evolve and to evolve rapidly and to really change the way that human society works. So going back to normal, even though it's very comfortable for me, seems like the wrong thing to do when we have this opportunity in front of us. And so I think that for me is really the impetus to not go back to normal, to let's not get back to normal, but really to think about how am I going to change my life and how am I going to contribute to changing society. And I think that we have a unique opportunity to create a more just society at this point in human history, that there's an openness to that. And I think nowhere is this more true than one of the greatest injustices that exists, particularly in our American society, which is racial injustice. And as a Baha'i, I'm kind of in a very unique position when it comes to racial justice, because I have a spiritual mandate for racial justice. I think it's a little bit different than you know, a lot of other people in the world who also believe in racial justice. But for me, it's a spiritual mandate. For me, it's part of my faith is that I have to work towards spiritual justice. Towards racial justice. Shoghi Effendi, one of the central figures of the Baha'i faith, when speaking to the American Baha'i community, said that regarding the solution of the racial problem, the believers should, of course, realize that the principle of the oneness of mankind, which is the cornerstone of the message of Baha'u'llah, is wholly incompatible with all forms of racial prejudice. So we can see that for me as a Baha'i, racial prejudice is incompatible with my faith. So I can't be a Baha'i and be racist. Yet we have to be really careful about that idea, right? There's another quote from Abdul Baha, another central figure of the Baha'i faith, that says, "All prejudices between man and man are falsehoods and violations of the will of God. God desires unity and love." So we can see that so much of, you know, the differences that are in the world today, a lot of them driven by religion, we as Baha'is believe have nothing to do with religion, have nothing to do with faith, that God really desires us to be unified, regardless of our skin color, regardless of our socioeconomic status, regardless of our nationality, regardless of our religious backgrounds. So this is, for me growing up here in the United States, it was very easy for me to believe that, okay, well, I've kind of done my work, right? Because I'm a Baha'i, and I believe in the oneness of mankind, and I believe in racial justice. So my work is done. But I think that that's a dangerous, and that allows us to fall into this kind of normalcy, right? It allows us to think, okay, well, we've done what we need to do, and we can live comfortable lives. But I think that if we look at the situation more closely, we have to understand that racial justice is what we're working towards. It's not where we're at. Unity and love is what we're working towards. It's not where we're at. So just because I believe in something doesn't mean that I have been able to fully manifest that in my actions. And for me, this was a really important realization to come to. And the Baha'i writings do address this. There is a statement, again, to the American Baha'i community, speaking specifically about racial injustice and racism, that says, "No one is immune to this disorder. We are all members of this society, and to some degree suffer the effects of its maladies." So we can see that just by living in this society, by living in the United States, we are going to, in some ways, be affected by racism. It's going to have some effect on us through the media, through institutions that have racism intertwined in their very existence. So to pretend that we can just say, "Oh, I'm a Baha'i and that's good enough," is in some ways the best way for me to put it, a dream, really. And hopefully eventually we'll get there, but that's certainly not where we're at right now. And we're told, it says, "As to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which for well nigh a century has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole structure of American society, it should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage in its evolution." It says, "A long and thorny road beset with pitfalls still remains untraveled." Right, so we can see that we're being told that, yes, as Baha'is, racism is incompatible with our belief. But at the same time, we live in a racist society. And to believe that we can use the Baha'i faith as an excuse to not do the work that needs to be done is incongruent with really what we believe as Baha'is. And I think this is an understanding that I think also applies to broader society, because there's this idea, right now in society, well, if I live a good life and I'm a good person, that's enough, right? If I don't harm it, do no harm. I even see people walking around with these t-shirts, "Do no harm," that's good enough. But I think we're at a point in human history when that's not good enough. We're at a point in human history when we have to give of ourselves and sacrifice to build a better society. And that's not to say that love isn't enough. I think love is enough. But love isn't simply the words love, right? Anyone who is in love, anyone who's in a relationship, requires that love is hard work. Love is sacrifice. And most of all, love requires truth. And that's one of the other things that we've been lacking. That's going back to normal, means accepting a narrative that is a false narrative, that is not true. And I like to use the analogy of kind of swimming in a river, and we're trying to swim upstream. We're trying to swim against this tide of racism that's coming at us. And this is where that idea of daily vigilance is so important, because if you stop swimming, you're going to get carried away. And to me, that's what normalcy really is referring to. It's the idea that we can stop swimming and just be comfortable and get carried away with that tide. But the second you stop swimming, that current is going to pull you away from where we're trying to get to. And this was very clear in my life as someone who was born in Iran and immigrated to the United States at a very young age. I was always trying to fit into American society. And for me, that was white society is what I was trying to fit into. You know, that was what was set before me as kind of the goal, the ideal, you know, and in some ways I'm the American dream, right? I'm an immigrant. My family came here with 4 suitcases. Now I'm a wealthy physician. You know, the American dream is alive and well, but it all depends on what that dream is, right? It all depends on what lie we believe, I guess. Because what I learned in this country was a lie. You know, what I was taught in school was that, you know, we had slavery and it was bad. And then Martin Luther King marched and now everything is good. And that's literally what we were taught about. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. And on top of that, I had my own cultural biases from my Persian culture, which is also a racist culture. It's a culture that values whiteness, or where lighter skin is seen as being more beautiful, right? So I have these kind of what American society taught me, as well as kind of my own cultural background, all of which kind of point me towards this white-centric, anti-Black kind of thought in my mind, despite what I believe as a Baha'i. And feeding into this is also what I can see in society around me, right? I can see that any metric that I use, Black people in this country are worse off, whether I'm looking at healthcare, at life expectancy, at economics, at educational achievement. So that narrative that we're fed leaves us with this idea of, well, what's wrong with Black people, right? That's, you know, I wouldn't say that out loud at the time, but that's the thought that was in the back of my head, right? That, well, it's got to be, you know, whatever's happening must be their own fault, because I didn't have any connection to know what was happening, and I believed the narrative that I was given, right? And I could say, well, look at me, I came here with nothing, I've been successful, so why haven't you been able to be successful? But part of this comes to the fact that I made a mistake as a Baha'i in trying to assimilate and trying to find normalcy in the ills in a sick society, right? In a society that's sick. And so that sickness is what became normal to me. There's a quote from Shoghi Effendi. It says, "The American believers, both individually and as an organic community, must under no circumstances be confounded with the characteristics and nature of the people from which God has raised them up. A sharp distinction between that community and that people must be made." Right? So we're told as Baha'is that we respect this country, and this country has a lot of great things, and in many ways has set the example for justice around the world. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its illnesses. That doesn't mean that is what we're aspiring to, right? And so this narrative that we're taught as the narrative of meritocracy. And it's really the ideology of the United States, right? It's this idea of, oh, there is an even playing field. And this is from Peggy McIntosh. She says, "We are taught the myth of meritocracy. This underlies the ideology of the United States. Whatever an individual ends up with in life must be what he or she wanted, worked for, earned, and deserved. This is the US myth of equal opportunity for all. It makes it easy to believe that if people don't succeed," now I'm paraphrasing, "it's because they aren't smart enough or don't work hard enough," right? And this is what I was taught. There's another quote from our own Dr. Joy. It says, "How many times have we heard a variation of slavery's over? You are all blessed to live in a nation where all you have to do is pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, work hard, and so become anything you want, even president. So why are you still angry?" And all of these ideas, all of these sentiments, I think, come from, and this is a belief that I was taught, but I think it's a belief that is still very much part of the fiber of American society, which is that we have an equal playing field. Because we're not taught the true history of what has happened in this country. And so without truth, we can't have love. If I don't understand who you are, if I don't understand the wounds that you have, if I don't understand what you've gone through, then how can I love you? Right? If I'm not willing to take the time to learn those things. And so this is where, one of the tenets of the Baha'i faith is the independent investigation of truth. And this is where I was at fault, because I didn't utilize that tenet. I believed what I was told. I believed the narrative that the media fed me, but I didn't take the time to actually do my own research, because the truth is not very far under the surface. You don't have to dig very deep to understand the truth of what has happened to our Black brothers and sisters in this country. Right? If we look at even the history of global anti-Blackness and colonialism, it started with the doctrine of discovery. Right? This is when the Catholic Church and the other kind of sects of Christianity took suit and followed, said that basically anywhere that a European Christian goes that's not already inhabited by a European Christian, they can claim that as their land. That other people who are not Christian and not white are savages, and they basically have no right to that land. And in fact, you are doing God's work by taking that land and by teaching them about Christianity. I'm not making this up. There were papal bulls, which are messages sent out by the Pope that said this. And this, within this idea, is also what we had here in the United States, the idea of manifest destiny, right? The idea that led to the genocide of the Native American people and the taking of their lands. This idea that it is our God-given right that this country is supposed to extend from coast to coast, and that God wants us to have this land. There is this concept that we see across religions of, we have this God-given right to do something, right? To commit injustice. Whereas every writing that you read from religions talk about justice. It's clearly a man-made artifact of religion. So, when we look at the history of this country, when we look at slavery, and when we look at the things that happened post-slavery, things like Jim Crow, redlining, gerrymandering, segregation, the unequal distribution of the GI Bills, it's amazing to me what Black people have endured in this country. And there came a point where they created their own communities, because they said, if you're not going to give us justice, we'll create our own communities. And they created thriving communities. And what happened was this country went in and destroyed those communities, literally, right? You can read about this. You can read about Tulsa. You can read about Wilmington. You can read that basically every time Black people have tried to rise up and make their own lives better, we as a society have held them back. The most recent incarnation of this is certainly the war on drugs and mass incarceration, right? Another means to disenfranchise Black communities. And so once we learn the true history, it changes the narrative, right? The narrative changes from what's wrong with Black people to how great are Black people that they have endured all of this, and they are still here being successful, and they are still here full of love, and they are still here willing to forgive, right? To me, it completely changes the narrative. But I think that means we can't go back to normal, right? Once you have this truth, you can't go back to normal. Once you have this information, if you go back to normal, then it's like you haven't learned all that. It's like you're saying, yeah, I know all that, but that's, I'm just going to stick to my own comfort, and I'm not going to worry about what's been done to get me here. And for me, that's an important point, because I have to understand that my wealth, yeah, I worked hard for it, right? I worked hard to be wealthy. I went to medical school. I did this and I did that. But ultimately, the fact that I even had the opportunity to do that is built on the backs of Black people, right? Because the wealth of this country came from slavery. It came from 400 years of free labor that allowed us to go from being kind of rural colonies to the largest economic power in the world in a very short span of time, right? There's a quote from Edward Baptist, the author of The Half Has Never Been Told, that I'd like to share. It says, the idea that the commodification and suffering and forced labor of African Americans is what made the United States powerful and rich is not an idea that people are necessarily happy to hear, yet it is the truth. And I think from an economic standpoint, people will occasionally try to argue with this, but I think it's very difficult to argue with it. When you look at what made America rich was cotton, what made America rich was tobacco, and who were the people producing that, right? So we have a country that is the wealthiest country in the world, yet the people who actually generated that wealth have not been allowed access to it. Yet I, an immigrant, who had nothing to do with generating that wealth, have been able to come here and be wealthy and have access to it. I think that the change that is required of us is change that requires it to be done from the bottom up. It's a grassroots change, and it's change that I genuinely believe can only be instituted in a lasting way through the vision of the Baha'i faith, which is the oneness of humanity, right? Because racism always finds a way, as we've seen, in just what I've listed out here through history. Racism always finds a way to pop up its ugly head. This is from the Universal House of Justice in 2020. It says, sadly, however, your nation's history reveals that any significant process towards racial equality has invariably been met by countervailing processes, overt or covert, that serve to undermine the advances achieved and to reconstitute the forces of oppression by other means. If you look at the income and health status of the average Black male today, it is not better than during the time of Martin Luther King. So we think we've made advances, but that's just so we can make ourselves feel better. When you look at the truth of it, when you look at the facts, when you look at like I listed before, health, education, income, all of these things, we haven't made progress. So when you look at true metrics, we haven't made progress. And so getting back to this idea that we can't return to normal because we really are at a point where we have a unique opportunity for rapid evolution of our society. To me, that's revolution, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about revolution. And to me, the Baha'i faith is revolutionary. And a lot of times we ourselves as Baha'is don't view it that way because it's a very peaceful religion, right? We're not allowed to take up arms, and we think of revolution in the terms of, violent military revolutions, right? But those revolutions have never served to bring justice. We can look at throughout the history of humanity, every revolution that has occurred that has been a violent revolution, all that it did was it transferred power from one group of wealthy elite people to another group of wealthy elite people, right? It never gave power to the average person. So what the Baha'i faith has, through really a series of community building institutions, is it has given us the ability to create revolution from the ground up instead of from the top down. And to create revolution where we can build justice in our personal relationships, we can build justice in our communities, and by doing that, we can build justice in society in general. It's from the ground up, because every time we've tried to do it from the top down, as that previous quote said, racism has found another way through. So the only way really to address this problem is from the bottom up. So it's really a revolution of creating justice for the average person. And certainly this applies most heavily to racial justice, because that's where we're seeing, at least in our country, the greatest injustice, but building it from the ground up. The establishment of just relationships among individuals, communities, and institutions of society that will uplift all and will not designate anyone as other. So this is the vision of the Baha'i faith. It's very different than what we're seeing in our country right now. We see the political divide, we see the racial divide, we see religious divide, we see, there's every kind of divide that you can think about. But what we're talking about is creating a circle that has room for everyone, where we all live with each other in justice. There's a quote from April 2002. It says, "There's no doubt that however protracted and painful the struggle, the outcome will be to revolutionize relationships among all peoples at the grassroots level. So that's really what we're talking about. And I think that really racism is a disease of materialism. If you look at its roots, it's rooted in power and it's rooted in economic gain. It always has been and it still is today. So that requires a spiritual solution. The only way to fight materialism is in my mind through spirituality, through understanding that there is more to our existence than this material world. You know, in my mind, in some ways, if you believe that, you know, we have, you know, that we're all at odds with each other and it's about, you know, passing on your genes and making sure your group survives, then racism makes sense, right? It's all about, you know, making sure that you have the most land, you have the most materialism, et cetera, et cetera. And this is where I think religion is so powerful to be able to overcome this problem, yet religion hasn't stepped up to the plate until now. Because actually, if we look at so many of the injustices in this world currently, their foundation is actually in religion. And it's not in the religion itself. I'm not speaking bad about Islam or Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or any of these religions, right? I believe in all of these religions, but it's what man has done with those religions and what the leaders of those religions have done with those religions, right? I'm just going to read the second sentence here. It says, "Yet the greater part of organized religion stands paralyzed at the threshold of the future, gripped in those very dogmas and claims of privileged access to truth that have been responsible for creating some of the most bitter conflicts dividing the earth's inhabitants." So this is very different than the vision of the Baha'i faith. This idea of privileged access to truth, and we see this in every religion, but that's not what the Baha'i faith believes. We believe that there's one God and one religion, and all of these religions that we call different religions are really branches of the same tree, that they're all here to teach us to love one another and to live in unity. So I think, you know, what we need now is not a return to normal, but it is, you know, revolutionary change. And I'll leave you with one final quote, and then turn things over to Dr. Joy, I think, who's going to speak about, you know, what's happening and what kind of change is really required. But this is from also a recent letter from this past July specifically to the Baha'is of the United States. And it says that when we're talking about the oneness of humanity, that the implications of this, right, are a profound alteration of thought and action. A profound alteration of thought and action. I mean, that's just another way of saying you can't go back to doing what you were doing before, right? You have to change. If we want to change society, we have to change ourselves. We have to change the way we live our lives. We have to change what we're doing. So one of the things that I did for myself was I created a personal action plan of what I'm going to do, how I'm going to change. You know, at some point, if people want, they can reach out to me offline, and I'd be happy to share that plan with them. But I'd like to kind of turn things over to Dr. Joy